The crimson emergency strobe pulsed like a dying heart against the bulkhead of the Icarus Aegis. For Vax and Kroll, the rhythm was more than a warning. It was a physical insult. Each flash revealed the encroaching oily sheen of the void blight, a semi-sentient necrotic fog that was currently eating the primary coolant lines of Sector 4. "Check your 6, Kroll. The spooks are coming through the vents." The voice crackled over his comms, shattered, distorted by the atmospheric interference of the blight. It was Jax, one of the deck apes from security, but the man sounded like he was being put through a meat grinder. "I'm a bit busy not dying, Jax. Keep your shirt on," Vaxon yelled back, his fingers dancing across the interface of his flux welder. The tool hummed, a high-pitched whine that set his teeth on edge. He was trying to fuse a titanium mesh patch over a ruptured conduit before the entire deck became a vacuum. His hands, covered in a mixture of hydraulic fluid and his own sweat, shook slightly. He wasn't a soldier. He was a spark, a grease monkey with a high-clearance badge, and he was currently trapped in a corridor that smelled like ozone and rotting copper. A wet, thumping sound echoed from the ceiling. Vaccine froze. The void blight didn't just eat metal, it reconstituted it into something hungry. "Fubar," he whispered, a term inherited from ancestors who fought in mud and dirt, long before the stars became their backyard. "Totally Fubar." He finished the weld, the molecular bond snapping into place with a satisfying click. He didn't wait to admire his work. He grabbed his kit and scrambled toward the heavy blast doors, his boots clattering against the deck plating. Then the world tilted. An explosion rocked the frigate, sending Vaxon sprawling. The gravity plating flickered, momentarily failing, leaving him weightless and disoriented in a cloud of debris. As the artificial gravity slammed back on, he hit the floor hard, the air driven from his lungs. Through the haze of his own blurred vision, he saw a silhouette. It was tall, framed in the jagged hole of the breached bulkhead. It stood with a predatory stillness that no human could replicate. Obsidian scales glinted under the red light, and a blade of pure, humming resonance was held in a low guard. "Kroll," the figure said. The voice wasn't a sound, but a vibration that traveled through the floor and up into his marrow. "Soul?" Vaccine gasped, clutching his bruised ribs. "You're late for the party, Hardshell." Karina Soul, the Vorgoth blade mistress who had shared his living quarters for the last 6 months, didn't offer a hand. She didn't offer a smile. She simply stepped over him, her golden-veined scales pulsing with a cold, rhythmic light. "The breach is systemic," she stated, her words precise as a scalpel. "Move, human. This sector is lost to the blackout." 6 months earlier, the transfer to the Icarus Aegis was supposed to be a promotion. Instead, Vaxon found himself standing in front of Quarter 402, clutching a duffel bag that smelled of stale coffee and burnt circuits, staring at a set of orders that had to be a joke from high command. "Shared quarters?" Vaxon muttered to the deck officer, a weary woman who looked like she hadn't slept since the last solar flare. "With a Vorgoth? Are you kidding me? They breathe at a different frequency or something, right? And I've heard they don't even use chairs." "The Synaptic Concord requires cultural integration, Kroll," the officer said, her voice a flat monotone. "You're a senior engineer. She's a strategic liaison. You're both high-value assets. Command wants you in a secure central block. Now bug out. I've got 40 more arrivals to process." Vaxon sighed, keyed his access code, and the door hissed open. The room was a standard military rectangle, compact, efficient, and currently divided by an invisible, impenetrable wall of tension. On the left, his side, was a mess of half-disassembled drones and crates of unauthorized snacks. On the right was a temple. Karina Saul was sitting on a raised obsidian platform, her legs crossed in a way that looked agonizing. She was naked save for the intricate patterns of her scales, which were a deep, matte black. Her eyes, glowing like dying embers, turned toward him. Vaxon felt a sudden, irrational urge to apologize for existing. "You are Vaxon Kroll," she said. The vibrations of her voice made the loose screws on his workbench rattle. "That's me. The guy who pays the rent. Or, well, the guy who fixes the life support so we don't turn into popsicles." He tried for a grin. It died on his face when she didn't blink. I require 32 minutes of absolute silence every 12 hours for resonance tuning, she informed him. During this time, you will not utilize your primitive audio devices. You will not tinker. Is this understood? Vaxon dropped his bag on the bunk. It hit the frame with a loud thud. Karina flinched, her scales flashing a sharp, irritated yellow. Look, Sul, Vaxine said, crossing his arms. I've got 24 hours a day of ship-wide headaches to deal with. This room is where I crash. I'm loud, I'm messy, and I like my music. If you want a monk's cell, you picked the wrong species to bunk with. She rose from her platform in one fluid motion. She was nearly 7 feet tall, a tower of muscle and ancient military tradition. She stepped into his space, the scent of cold stone and incense wafting off her. I did not pick you, human. You are a necessity, a tool, nothing more. A tool? Great. I'm a wrench, Vaxon scoffed. And you're just a very expensive paperweight until someone needs something stabbed. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a moon. Karina's scales settled into a dull, threatening gray. We shall see, Kroll. We shall see who holds the weight when the stars go dark. Karina's soul found the human condition to be an affront to the concept of entropy. Everything about Vaxon Kroll was a leak. He leaked sound through the tinny speakers of his handheld devices. He leaked scent, the acrid tang of grease and the sickeningly sweet aroma of synth calf. He even leaked emotion, his frustrations radiating off him like heat from a poorly insulated reactor. In the Vorgoth philosophy of Valkora, one's presence should be a closed circuit. To waste energy on unnecessary movement or noise was to invite the decay of the universe into one's soul. Kroll, she said, her voice a low thrumming against the bulkhead. You are vibrating. Vaxon looked up from his bunk, where he was currently surrounded by at least 50 meters of fiber optic cabling. He was tapping his foot against the metal frame. Tap, tap, slide, tap, tap, slide. It's called rhythm, Sul. Ever heard of it? He didn't stop. It helps me think. The secondary power grid on Deck 9 is fluctuating by 0.3%. It's driving me crazy. It is a negligible variance, Karina replied, returning her attention to the maintenance of her resonance blade. The weapon was a masterpiece of Vorgoth engineering, a hilt of forged star matter that projected a localized field of high-frequency disruption. Your anxiety is more disruptive than the power grid. Maybe for you, Vaxin muttered, finally stopping the tapping. He leaned back, his eyes dark with the kind of exhaustion only those who live in the guts of a ship understand. But I'm the one who has to go down there and crawl through the Jeffries tubes if that negligible variance turns into a full-blown surge. Karina paused. She watched him, her scales flickering a soft, curious blue. You speak of the ship as if it were a living thing, a body. Isn't it? Vaxine asked, his voice losing its sarcastic edge. We're in a tin can surrounded by millions of kilometers of nothingness. This ship breathes for us. It keeps our blood from boiling. If the Aegis dies, we die. I'm just the doctor. A doctor who smells of burnt sugar, Karina observed, her eyes narrowing. It's a donut, Soul. A replicated donut. Want a bite? It might help you loosen up. You look like you're made of granite. I am made of the history of my clan, she snapped, her scales flashing a defensive obsidian. I do not require replicated waste. She turned away, but the image of him, huddled among his wires, worrying about a 0.3% variance, stayed with her. In the Vorgoth military, engineers were considered lower caste, almost akin to servants. They were the ones who cleaned the blades, not the ones who wielded them. But Vaxin Kroll didn't act like a servant. He acted like he owned the ship's heart. Present day. The Icarus Aegis groaned as the void blight began to compress the hull of Sector 4. The sound was like a giant grinding its teeth. Karina Sol moved through the hallway, her blade a blur of silver light. She didn't fight the blight. She parried it. The oily tentacles of the entity lashed out from the ceiling, trying to find purchase on her armor, but she moved with a geometric precision that left her untouched. Behind her, Vaxin was struggling to keep up. He had his flux welder in one hand and a heavy-duty sensor array in the other. The core is 300 meters that way. Vaxin pointed toward a heavy blast door that was currently being eaten by a colony of glowing purple spores. If we don't get there in 5 minutes, the containment field is going to pop. and we'll all be nothing but stardust and bad memories. The path is blocked by a secondary manifestation, Karina said, her scales pulsing a frantic red. I can clear a path, but I cannot hold it for long. The energy drain is significant. Wait, Vaxen grabbed her shoulder. She stiffened. Vorgoth did not like being touched, but he didn't let go. Look at the patterns on the spores. They're pulsing at the same frequency as your blade. They aren't just eating the ship, they're mimicking the energy signatures around them. Karina looked. He was right. The Void Blight was a mirror. It was adapting to her combat style. If you keep swinging that sword, you're just feeding it, Vaxen said, his eyes wide with a sudden, dangerous realization. We need to change the frequency. We need to make some noise. Noise is waste, Karina instinctively argued. Noise is what's going to save our lives. Give me your blade. Karina stared at him. The request was unthinkable. A Vorgoth blade was a sacred extension of their soul. To give it to a human, especially one whose hands were covered in grease, was the ultimate sacrilege. Kroll, you do not understand the resonance. I understand that the hard-shell protocol is going to get us killed, Vaxen yelled, the red strobe light reflecting in his desperate eyes. Trust me. For once in your life, stop being a warrior and start being a roommate. Give me the blade. Around them, the walls of the Icarus Aegis began to weep black oil. The Void Blight was closing in, a silent, hungry dark. Karina looked at the human, this messy, loud, anxious creature who spent his nights worrying about the ship's breath. She saw the courage in his shaking hands. She handed him the hilt. If you break it, she whispered, the vibrations of her voice thick with a new, terrifying emotion. I will ensure your afterlife is very, very loud. Vaxen took the weapon, the weight of it nearly pulling him down. He didn't swing it. Instead, he ripped a panel off his sensor array and began to bypass the blade's internal dampeners with a length of copper wire. All right, soul, Vaxen grinned, a wild, jagged look. Let's see if this tool can play a song. The vibration of the Vorgoth blade in Vaxen's hand was not like the steady hum of a fusion torch or the predictable thrum of a plasma cutter. It felt alive, a trapped gale of wind screaming to be let out of a very small, very expensive box. As Vaxen tinkered with the hilt, stripping back the elegant obsidian casing to expose the crystalline lattice beneath, he felt Karina's gaze burning into the back of his neck. It was a cold, heavy weight, the kind of stare that usually preceded a court-martial or a funeral. Steady on, Vaxen, he told himself, his breath hitching as a spark jumped from the blade to his thumb. Don't blow the hard shell's favorite toy to kingdom come, or she'll feed you to the vents piece by piece. He had bypassed the primary safety limiters, an act that felt like removing the brakes from a shuttle while it was mid-re-entry. By wiring the blade's resonance frequency to the output of his sensor array, he was essentially creating a feedback loop. If his theory was right, the blade wouldn't just cut, it would scream at a pitch that shattered the biological mimicry of the Void Blight. You are damaging the structural integrity of the focus crystal, Karina said. Her voice was a low, dangerous vibration that shook the very air in his lungs. I'm not damaging it. I'm liberating it, Vaxen grunted, wiping a smear of black grease onto his tactical vest. The Blight is eating our comms and our sensors because it likes the rhythm. It's a parasite that sings along to the ship's tune. I'm about to give it a heavy dose of static. He finished the bridge, the copper wire glowing a dull orange as it struggled to handle the raw power flowing through it. He stood up, his boots squelching in the black ichor that was beginning to puddle on the floor. 10 meters away, the Void Blight had finished consuming the bulkhead door. It didn't look like a fog anymore. It had coalesced into a towering mass of oily, translucent limbs and thousands of tiny vibrating cilia that mimicked the red strobe of the emergency lights. Sit rep, Saul, Vaxen whispered, his finger hovering over the activation stud. The entity has reached 98% mass saturation for this corridor, Karina replied, her scales shifting to a sharp, aggressive crimson. Her own hands were empty, her posture a coiled spring of suppressed violence. It is preparing to lunge. Kroll, if this fails, the containment breach will be the least of our concerns. Trust the grease monkey, hard shell. On 3, 1, 2. On three, Vaxon slammed his thumb down. The sound was unimaginable. It wasn't something you heard with your ears. It was something you felt in your teeth, your liver, and the very fluid in your eyes. The resonance blade didn't project a beam of light. It projected a wall of pure, agonizing white noise. The air between them and the blight shattered, the atmospheric pressure dropping so sharply that Vaxon's ears popped with the force of a gunshot. The void blight didn't just die, it disintegrated. The oily limbs turned to gray ash in a heartbeat, the vibration stripping the molecules of their cohesion. The screeching feedback lasted for exactly 4 seconds before the copper wire melted, plunging the blade back into darkness. Silence returned to the corridor, heavier than the noise that had preceded it. Vaxon slumped against the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Holy mother of... It worked, he gasped, staring at the smoking hilt in his hand. Did you see that? Total atomic disruption. Foobarred the whole mess. Karina stepped forward, her movement slow, almost hesitant. She looked at the gray ash coating the floor, then at the scorched hilt. Her scales were a pale, shimmering violet, a color Vaxon had never seen before. You turned a weapon of honor into a chaotic broadcast, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Hey, it saved our skins, didn't it? Don't get your scales in a twist. She didn't answer. She took the hilt from his hand, her fingers brushing his. For a second, the coldness of her skin felt less like stone and more like silk. She looked at him, her ember-glow eyes searching his face as if she were seeing a ghost. Noise, she murmured. Perhaps there is a purpose to it after all. 120 days before the blackout, the interior of Quarter 402 had been a battlefield of a different kind. Vaxon sat at the small fold-down table, staring with profound suspicion at a bowl of steaming, grayish-blue mash. It was Taven porridge, a Vorgoth staple that smelled like old wet socks and iron filings. Across from him, Karina sat in her customary meditative pose, her scales a neutral, disciplined gray. You're staring at your sustenance again, Kroll, she observed without opening her eyes. It is inefficient. I'm not staring, I'm mourning, Vaxon replied, poking the mash with a plastic spoon. I'm mourning the fact that I have to eat something that looks like it was scraped off a heat exchanger. Why can't you people use spices, or salt, or anything that doesn't involve the word replicated protein? Flavor is a distraction of the senses, Karina said, her voice smooth and devoid of inflection. We eat to maintain the biological machine. To do otherwise is to indulge in the chaos of the flesh. Vaxon sighed, pushing the bowl away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crinkled bag of zesty zingers, contraband corn chips that were roughly 40% salt and 60% chemical flavoring. He popped one into his mouth with a loud, defiant crunch. Karina's scales flared a bright, irritated yellow. That sound, it is abrasive. It's called a snack, Soul. Try one. It might jumpstart that logic gate you call a brain. He tossed a chip toward her. It landed on her obsidian platform. For a long minute, she simply stared at the bright orange triangle as if it were a live grenade. Then slowly, she picked it up with 2 fingers. She placed it in her mouth and chewed. Her entire body stiffened. Her scales went through a rapid-fire sequence of colors. Yellow, green, a startled blue, and finally a deep, confused purple. It is an explosion of unnecessary data, she whispered, her eyes wide. My tongue is vibrating. That's the zing, baby, Vaxon laughed, leaning back in his chair. See? A little chaos isn't going to kill you. Sometimes you need a bit of static to know you're alive. The amusement faded from his face as he noticed the way her scales settled into a dull, flat gray, the color of mourning. He realized, not for the first time, that she wasn't just here as a liaison. She was an exile. The way she clung to her rituals, her silence, her flavorless food. It wasn't just discipline, it was a shield. She was terrified that if she let even a little bit of the human world in, she would lose whatever she had left of her own. Hey, Vaxon said, his voice softening. I didn't mean to. Look, I know this assignment sucks. Being stuck with a loudmouth engineer in a tin can 3 light years from nowhere isn't exactly the dream. Karina looked at him, and for the first time, Vaxon saw a crack in the obsidian. I was a member of the cast of Silence, she said, her voice so low he had to lean in to hear it. In my world, to speak as I am speaking to you now is a mark of the unclean. I was sent here because I listened to the wind on the high plains of Velonis. I found the sound of the storm to be beautiful. My elders called it a sickness, a corruption of the soul. Vaxin felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years, genuine, unadulterated sympathy. He had always seen her as a cold, arrogant warrior. He hadn't realized she was a refugee from a culture that punished the very thing that made her an individual. Well, Vaxin said, clearing his throat and trying to hide the lump in it, on this ship, beautiful isn't a sickness. It's a requirement. You keep listening to the storms, Hardshell. I'll keep making the noise. Between the two of us, maybe we'll find a middle ground. Karina looked down at the orange dust on her fingers. A small, almost imperceptible tremor ran through her scales. Middle ground, she repeated. A curious concept, Vaxin Kroll. In my world, there is only the silence, or the void. Yeah, well, humans invented the third option, Vaxin said, standing up to clear the table. It's called muddling through, and we're damn good at it. Presently, the Icarus Aegis groaned again, a sound of buckling metal that vibrated through Vaxin's boots. The temporary victory over the void blight in the corridor had bought them time, but the ship's primary systems were failing one by one. Oxygen scrubbers in Sector 9 just went offline, Vaxin said, checking his HUD. That's where the civilian refugees are being held. If we don't get the core stabilized, those people have about 30 minutes of breathable air left. 30 minutes, Karina said, her voice regaining its steely edge as she resheathed her damaged blade. The core is 200 meters below us. The elevators are dead. We must use the service shafts. The service shafts are crawling with those things, Sewell, and my welder is low on juice. Then we do not use your welder, Karina said, stepping toward the maintenance hatch. She looked back at him, her scales a deep, determined blue. We use the third option. We muddle through. Vaxin couldn't help it. He let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. Gods, I've created a monster. Lead the way, Hardshell. I'm right behind you. As they dropped into the dark, cramped confines of the service shaft, Vaxin realized that his prejudice toward her had been a mirror of her own toward him. He had seen a statue. She had seen a nuisance. Neither had seen the person underneath the armor and the grease. Now, as they crawled through the dark together, the lines between them were beginning to blur, fused together by the heat of a crisis that didn't care about their origins. He reached out and tapped the back of her scale-covered heel. Hey, Soul, if we make it out of this, I'm buying you a real donut. Not a replicated one. A real, greasy, sugar-coated masterpiece from the colony at Nexara. I shall hold you to that, human, she whispered back, but only if it does not vibrate too much. Karina Saul moved through the vertical service shaft with a grace that felt increasingly foreign to her. The darkness of the Icarus Aegis was absolute, save for the faint, rhythmic pulse of her own bioluminescence and the erratic beam of Vaxin's flashlight below her. To a Vorgoth, darkness was not an absence of sight, it was an absence of truth. Her people believed that light was the physical manifestation of logic, and to be shrouded in shadow was to be lost in the great unmaking. Yet as she climbed, she found herself relying less on the logic of her eyes and more on the chaotic sensory inputs that Vaxin had forced her to acknowledge over the past months. She could feel the ship, not just the cold metal, but the frantic, uneven heartbeat of the dying engines. She could hear the void blight, a wet, slithering sound that resonated in the hollow spaces of the bulkheads. And most clearly of all, she could hear Vaxin's breathing. It was ragged, strained, and filled with a stubborn, frantic energy. He is so fragile, she thought, her scales flickering a somber gray. A few millimeters of titanium separate him from the vacuum. A single surge of energy could stop his heart. And yet he climbs. He fights. He makes noise. Hold up, Vaxin hissed from below. I'm picking up a massive heat signature at the junction. It's not a blight thing. It's a fire. The gas lines must have ruptured. Karina stopped, her claws digging into the rungs of the ladder. Can you bypass the flow? Not from here. I'd need to get to the manual override. but it's on the other side of the firewall. Sol, if that gas catches a spark from the failing gravity plates, this whole shaft becomes a cannon barrel. We'll be cooked before we can blink. Karina looked up. The exit was 50 meters above. The fire was 20 meters below them. They were caught in the throat of a dying beast. There is a vent, she said, her eyes scanning the dark. Sector 7G. It leads to the secondary armory. If we can reach it, we can bypass the firewall. Sector 7G? That's for the squishies, Karina. It's restricted. I don't have the codes. I do, she said. Move, Vaxen, now! They scrambled into the narrow ventilation duct, the metal hot against their skin. As they crawled, Karina felt a wave of dizziness. The air was thin, the oxygen levels dropping as the scrubbers failed. Her scales began to pale, a sign of oxygen deprivation that her body could not hide. Kroll, she whispered, her voice failing to vibrate. The air… I know. Just keep moving. Don't think about the breathing. Think about the donut. Remember? Nexara Station, the one with the pink frosting. Vaxen's voice was a lifeline. It was a tether of pure, ridiculous human hope that kept her from slipping into the great silence. She focused on the rhythm of his words, the way he used language not just to communicate data, but to provide comfort. It was a use of sound that her people would have found infantile, yet in this moment, it was more powerful than any Vorgoth meditation. 60 days before the blackout, Karina had stood in the center of the ship's primary hangar, watching Vaxen work. He was suspended by a single mag line 40 meters above the deck, his hands buried in the exposed circuitry of a long-range recon drone. A massive solar storm had fried the ship's external sensors, and the captain was demanding a fix before they drifted into the gravity well of a nearby gas giant. Kroll, you have 3 minutes before the radiation levels become lethal, the deck officer shouted from the safety of the control booth. I know the clock, Miller. Just keep your hair on, Vaxen yelled back. He was sweating, his face smeared with coolant, his hands moving with a speed that Karina found dizzying. He wasn't using a diagnostic computer. He was talking to the drone. Come on, you beautiful piece of junk, Vaxen muttered, his voice echoing in the vast hangar. I know you're hurting. Just give me a signal. Just one little blip. Don't do this to me. Not today. Karina watched from the observation deck, her scales a judgmental shade of green. To her, his behavior was a symptom of a disordered mind. One did not speak to machines. One maintained them through rigorous adherence to the manual. Suddenly, a localized surge of static electricity leaped from the hangar's damaged power coupling. It struck the mag line holding Vaxen, shorting out the magnetic lock. Vaxen fell. The hangar was a vacuum of sound for a split second. Then, Miller started screaming for the emergency crews, but they were too far away. Vaxen was plummeting toward the reinforced steel deck, a fall that would shatter every bone in his fragile human body. Karina didn't think. Thought was too slow. She moved. Her Vorgoth biology, honed for high-gravity combat, propelled her over the railing. She didn't use the stairs. She dropped 40 meters in a single, controlled leap. She hit the deck with a bone-jarring thud, her scales absorbing the impact, and she lunged forward. She caught him 3 meters above the deck. The momentum nearly tore her arms from their sockets. Vaxen slammed into her chest, his weight driving her into the hard floor. They skidded across the metal, a tangle of limbs and grease, stopping only when they hit the base of a support pillar. Silence returned to the hangar. Karina lay there, her scales a bruised, mottled purple, her breathing heavy. Vaxen was pinned under her, staring up at her with eyes the size of saucers. You jumped, Vaxen gasped, his voice shaking. 40 meters. You jumped for a grease monkey. Karina looked at him, her logic struggling to provide an explanation. She should have stayed on the observation deck. It was the rational, safe thing to do. Her life was worth more to the mission than his. And yet, the drone, she said, her voice a ragged vibration. Did you fix it? Vaxen blinked. Then he looked at the small, glowing component he was still clutching in his hand. He let out a shaky, hysterical laugh. Yeah, I got the blip. We're good, Saul. We're good. He sat up, leaning his head against her shoulder. He didn't pull away. He stayed there for a long time, the two of them covered in oil and dust, while the emergency crew scrambled around them. Thanks, Vaxin whispered. I guess, I guess I owe you one. You owe me many things, Vaxin Kroll, Karina replied, her scales slowly settling into a soft, warm blue. Starting with a quiet evening, without the zingers. Deal, he said. Absolute silence. For an hour, maybe even two. But they both knew it was a lie. Neither of them wanted the silence anymore. Presently, they tumbled out of the ventilation duct and onto the cold, hard floor of the secondary armory. The air here was slightly better, the emergency scrubbers in this sector still clinging to a fraction of their power. Karina lay on her back, her chest heaving, her scales slowly regaining their obsidian luster. Vaxin was beside her, coughing, his flashlight rolling across the floor. We made it, Vaxin wheezed. Sector 7G, home of the big guns. Karina forced herself to sit up. The armory was a graveyard of abandoned equipment, racks of plasma rifles, crates of pulse grenades, and the heavy armored shells of the Vorgoth vanguard. But it was what lay in the center of the room that caught her eye. A Vorgoth war hymn relay. It was an ancient piece of technology used by her ancestors to coordinate the resonance of their blades during planet-side sieges. It was a massive crystalline structure designed to amplify sound and vibration across an entire battlefield. Vaxin saw it too. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes lighting up with that familiar, manic engineer spark. Is that what I think it is? He asked, his voice hushed with awe. It is a relay, Karina said, her voice grave. It is used to unify the silence of the Vorgoth. It amplifies the frequency of the leader's blade so that all may act as one. Can it amplify a broadcast? Vaxin asked, stepping toward the crystal. Like a ship-wide broadcast? Karina realized what he was thinking. Her scales flashed a sharp, fearful yellow. Vaxin, that device is not meant for your static. It is a sacred instrument of focus. If you feed it the wrong frequency, the feedback could shatter every crystalline structure on the ship, including the engine core. The engine core is already shattering, Karina. The void blight is sitting on it like a fat cat. We need to hit it with a blast so loud it shakes the atoms of that thing apart. He looked at her, his face pale, his hands trembling. I can't do it without you. I can wire the input, but I don't know the resonance codes. I don't know how to make the crystal sing. Karina looked at the relay. In the Vorgoth culture, to use a war hymn relay was the highest honor. Only a high commander could touch it. To use it to broadcast noise was the ultimate desecration. It would be the final act that severed her from her people forever. Even if she survived, she would be a ghost, a name erased from the histories. She looked at Vaxin. He wasn't a high commander. He wasn't a warrior. He was just a man who didn't want the ship to die. He was a man who had shared his food, his noise, and his hope with her. She thought of the refugees in Sector 9. She thought of the blip on the drone. She thought of the wind on the high plains of Velonis. The resonance code is Alpha 49 Gamma, she said, her voice ringing with a sudden, fierce clarity. Vaxin stared at her. Then a wide, triumphant grin spread across his face. Alpha 49 Gamma. You got it, Hardshell. Let's make some music. He dove into the base of the relay, his flux welder sparking as he began to strip wires. He worked with a frantic, beautiful energy, his hands a blur of motion. Karina stood over him, her blade drawn, her scales glowing a brilliant, defiant gold. She was no longer a member of the Cast of Silence. She was no longer a refugee. She was a defender of the Icarus Aegis. Almost there, Vaxin grunted, his face drenched in sweat. I'm patching in the audio from the bridge and the engine diagnostics. I'm going to use the ship's own groans as the carrier wave. The blight won't know what hit it. Suddenly, the armory doors hissed open. A group of figures stepped through the smoke. They were Vorgoth, their armor polished and gleaming, their scales a uniform, icy white. In the center was a commander with a face as hard as obsidian. Commander Sul, the leader said, his voice a vibration that carried the weight of 1,000 years of tradition. Cease your actions immediately. You are desecrating a holy relic of the Vanguard. Karina felt a cold hand clutch her heart. Commander Vex, the ship is dying. The void blight. The ship is a casualty of war, Vex interrupted, his voice devoid of emotion. The void blight is a test of our resolve. We will meet it with silence, or we will die with honor. We will not allow a human to pollute our resonance with his filth. He raised his hand, and the warriors behind him leveled their resonance blades. Vaxon looked up from the relay, his eyes wide. Sul? We've got company, and they don't look like they're here for the donuts. Karina stepped in front of Vaxon, her blade humming with a low, dangerous frequency. She looked at her people, the warriors she had once admired, the culture she had once worshipped. She saw the beauty of their discipline, but she also saw the rot of their prejudice. They would rather die in the dark than accept the light from a human hand. There is no honor in a graveyard, Vex, Karina said, her scales blazing a blinding, brilliant white, a color that even the High Commander had never seen. You speak of silence, but you are only deaf. Move aside, or I will show you the true power of the wind. You are a traitor, Karina Sol, Vex said, his scales flickering with a murderous red. Kill them both. Save the relay. The warriors lunged. Vaxin ducked as a beam of resonance energy sliced through the air where his head had been. Karina, I need 2 minutes. Just 2 minutes. You have them, she said, her voice a roar of vibration that shook the entire room. She met the first warrior with a strike so fast it was invisible. Her blade didn't just parry, it shattered the other warrior's guard. She moved with a ferocity that was no longer Vorgoth. It was something else. It was the speed of the warrior tempered by the desperation of the human. She was fighting for more than honor. She was fighting for life. Vaxon's hands were a blur. Come on, connect, you piece of junk. Sing for me. Karina parried a blow from Vex, the impact sending a shockwave through her arms. He was stronger, older, and his technique was perfect. But he was fighting for a dead tradition. She was fighting for the person who had taught her how to taste the chaos. You have fallen so low, Vex hissed, his blade locked against hers, to defend a grease monkey. He is my friend, Karina said, and the word felt like a mountain moving in her soul. And he is the only one who knows how to fix what you are too proud to see. With a sudden, violent surge of energy, she kicked Vex back, sending him crashing into a rack of rifles. She turned to Vaxon. Kroll, now! Vaxon slammed his fist onto the final connection. The war hymn relay didn't just glow, it ignited. A pillar of pure, crystalline sound erupted from the device, shooting up through the ceiling and into the very spine of the ship. The sound was not static. It was not music. It was the Icarus Aegis herself. It was the hum of the scrubbers, the vibration of the plates, the frantic breathing of the refugees, and the stubborn, beautiful heartbeat of Vaxon Kroll. The frequency swept through the ship like a tidal wave. In the engine core, the void blight shrieked and dissolved into mist. In Sector 9, the air began to flow again, as the scrubbers were jolted back to life by the surge of energy. The Vorgoth warriors fell to their knees, clutching their heads, their refined senses overwhelmed by the raw, unadulterated power of the broadcast. Vex stared at the relay, his scales a dull, defeated gray, as the filth he had feared saved his life. Vaxon slumped against the relay, his face pale, his chest heaving. He looked at Karina, who was standing in the center of the room, her blade lowered, her scales glowing a soft, peaceful violet. We did it, Vaxon whispered, a weak grin spreading across his face. We foobarred the foobar. Karina walked over to him and helped him up. She didn't care about the High Commander. She didn't care about the exile. She only cared about the man who was currently wiping grease onto her golden vein scales. You are a very loud person, Vaxon Kroll, she said, her voice a warm, gentle vibration. Yeah, he said, leaning his head against her shoulder. But you're the one who knew the lyrics. They stood there in the echoing silence of the armory, two survivors who had found a new resonance in the heart of the ruin. The Icarus Aegis was still broken, the stars were still far away, but for the first time in their lives, they weren't alone in the dark. So, Vaxon said after a long minute, about that donut. Do you think we could get one with sprinkles? Thousands of tiny sugary sprinkles? Karina closed her eyes, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. If it is chaotic and unnecessary, I am certain you will find a way to make it happen. The silence that followed the crystalline scream of the war hymn relay was not peaceful. It was a vacuum, a heavy and suffocating absence of sound that felt like the ship itself had held its breath in terror. The iridescent glow of the crystal faded slowly, leaving the secondary armory in a dim, spectral light. Vax and Kroll remained slumped against the base of the machine, his hands still trembling from the feedback of the raw data stream. He looked up, expecting to see the scowling face of Commander Vex or the cold end of a resonance blade. Instead, he saw a graveyard of ideology. The Vorgoth warriors, once the peak of disciplined perfection, were scattered across the floor. Some were clutching their heads, their bioluminescent scales flickering in a sickly, erratic pattern. Vex himself was leaning against a rack of pulse rifles, his obsidian skin looking dull, almost gray. The broadcast hadn't just killed the Void Blight, it had shattered the silence of the Vorgoth present in the room. It had forced them to hear the ship, the human, and the chaos of existence all at once. It was a sensory overload that their rigid culture was never meant to survive. Kroll! Karina's voice was a ragged whisper. She was standing 10 paces away, her blade extinguished, her shoulders slumped with a weariness that went deeper than bone. Is it over? Vaxan wiped a smear of blood from his nose with the back of his hand. The blight in this sector is toasted. I'm picking up a massive dissipation across the whole ship. The frequency held. We foobarred the ghost, Saul. He struggled to his feet, his joints popping like dry twigs. He moved toward the primary console of the armory, his fingers ghosting over the buttons. He needed to check the diagnostics to make sure the static hadn't fried the life support systems while it was busy saving their skins. Stay back, human, Vex growled, though the threat lacked its usual bite. He tried to push himself off the rack, but his legs buckled, and he slid back down to the deck. You have polluted the sacred frequency. You have turned our history into a weapon of noise. I saved your life, Vex. Quit being a real piece of work for 5 minutes and look at the screens. Vaxon snapped, his patience for Vorgoth pride having evaporated somewhere between the service shaft and the armory floor. If I hadn't polluted your precious airwaves, you'd be a black puddle of oil right now. So you're welcome. Karina stepped between them, her gaze fixed on the central terminal. Her scales were a somber, bruised violet. Vaxin is right. The blight is retreating, but the origin point remains active. Look at the energy signature. She pointed to a pulsing purple dot on the holographic map of the Icarus Aegis. It wasn't in the engine core. It wasn't in the ventilation. It was located in the high-security observation lounge, the very place where the Tavan High Council envoys had been staying. Vaxin squinted at the data. His engineer's brain began to connect dots he didn't want to see. That doesn't make sense. The observation lounge has its own isolated power cell. The blight shouldn't have been able to get a foothold there unless it was invited in. What are you saying, Kroll? Vex asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. I'm saying this isn't a space virus or some random necrotic fog we picked up in a nebula, Vaxon said, his voice dropping an octave. Look at the decay rate. It's too structured, too intentional. This is a weapon, a designer plague meant to eat anything that doesn't share a specific genetic resonance. He began to bypass the security encryption on the lounge's black box recorder. His hands moved with a cold, clinical speed. He was no longer the joking grease monkey. He was a man looking for the truth in a pile of scrap. After 30 seconds of frantic coding, the screen flickered to life. The image was grainy, distorted by the residual interference of the relay. But the figures were unmistakable. 2 Tavan elders, their robes flowing and their scales glowing with an arrogant, icy white light, were standing over a small, crystalline canister. They weren't fighting the Void Blight. They were cultivating it. The splinter logic, Karina whispered, her scales turning a horrified, ghostly white. The separatists. On the screen, one of the elders spoke. The audio was cracked, but the message was clear. The union with the humans is a cancer upon the Vorgoth soul. Their noise, their filth, their messy biology, it dilutes our strength. The Icarus Aegis will be the pyre on which this alliance burns. When the ship is found as a hollow shell, the blame will fall on human incompetence. We will return to the silence. We will be pure again. The recording ended as a black, oily tentacle rose from the canister, lovingly stroking the elder's hand before beginning its work on the ship's hull. The silence in the armory this time was different. It was the sound of a world breaking. Vaxon looked at Karina, and his heart ached for her. Her entire life, her exile, her sacrifice. It had all been for a people who were willing to commit mass murder just to avoid hearing a human laugh. Vex stood up, his face a mask of obsidian tragedy. He looked at the screen, then at Karina, then at Vaxon. The pride was gone, replaced by a hollow, devastating clarity. They used the Oblivion Protocol, Vex said, his voice a flat, dead thrum. It is a forbidden science from the age of the first expansion, a weapon meant to erase entire civilizations from the inside out. And they put it on a ship with 600 humans and 200 of their own people, Vaxon said, his voice trembling with a cold white fury. Your High Council just tried to murder us all, Vex. Does that fit into your sacred logic? Vex didn't answer. He turned his head away, his scales fading to a dull, lightless gray. We have to stop it, Karina said, her voice regaining its strength. She stepped toward the exit, her blade humming back to life with a fierce, defiant gold. The canister in the lounge is the mother node. If we destroy it, the remaining blight will lose its directive. It will become nothing more than harmless soot. It's not going to be that easy, Vaxon said, grabbing his kit and checking the charge on his flux welder. The lounge is locked down. The elders will have the security droids on their side. And we've only got about 20 minutes before the ship's primary atmosphere fails completely. We're out of time, and we're out of friends. He looked at the warriors on the floor. Unless some of you want to actually do your jobs and protect the ship. Vex looked up. For a moment, Vaxon thought the commander would strike him, but then Vex reached for his own blade. He stood tall, his scales flickering with a faint, hesitant blue, the color of duty reborn. The council has betrayed the silence, Vex said. There is no honor in following a lie. Commander Soul, lead us. Karina nodded, her gaze meeting Vaxon's. In that moment, the humanistic thread they had woven between them over the past 6 months became a cable of steel. They weren't just roommates anymore. They were the only bridge between two species that were currently trying to tear each other apart. Let's move, Vaxon said, adjusting his cap. Time to go kick some elder ass. And Vex, try not to get in the way. This is going to get messy. 180 days before the blackout, the Icarus Aegis was docked at the orbital station of Heliox Prime. It was the first day of the joint mission, and the tension on the ship was so thick you could have cut it with a plasma torch. Vaxine was in the middle of moving his gear into quarter 402. He was carrying a crate of heavy-duty superconductors and a very old, very beat-up acoustic guitar he'd smuggled from Earth. He tripped over the threshold, sending the crate clattering across the deck, and the guitar sliding right into the feet of a very tall, very dark, and very annoyed-looking Vorgoth woman. Karina Soul looked down at the wooden instrument with profound confusion. What is this primitive wooden box, human? It's a guitar, Vaxon grumbled, scrambling to his feet. It makes music. You know, songs, melodies, things that make the day go by faster. It is a hollow chamber meant to amplify vibrations, Karina said, her scales a judgmental shade of green. It is a device of inefficiency. Why would you waste space on such a thing when the mission requirements are so stringent? Because if I don't have something to play, I'll start talking to the walls, and nobody wants that, Vaxon said, snatching the guitar back. Besides, it's not just a box. It's a way of remembering where I came from. We aren't all born in labs or military academies, you know. Karina crossed her arms, her presence filling the small room. In the Vorgoth culture, memory is maintained through the perfect silence. We do not require wooden boxes to tell us who we are. Yeah, well, in the human culture, we like to make a bit of a racket, Vaxine said, shoving the guitar under his bunk. Look, I know the brass stuck us together to play nice neighbors, but let's get one thing straight. I don't touch your meditation thingy. You don't touch my guitar. I keep the ship running. You keep the peace. Simple as that. Karina studied him for a long moment, her amber eyes glowing with a faint, inscrutable light. You think the universe is a thing to be negotiated with, Vaxon Kroll? You think that because you can fix a machine, you can fix the chaos of existence. I don't think I can fix the universe, Sewell, Vaxon said, leaning against his workbench. I just think it's better to face it with a tune in your head than a void in your heart. A void in the heart is the beginning of wisdom, she replied, her voice a low, cold vibration. But I suspect you will learn that the hard way. Vaxon just shrugged and reached for a screwdriver. Maybe, but at least I'll have something to play at the funeral. That night, as Karina sat in her perfect, motionless silence, she heard a faint, rhythmic sound from the other side of the room. It was Vaxon, barely touching the strings of the guitar, hummed a low, mournful melody that she didn't recognize. It was chaotic. It was unstructured. It was entirely human. And to her absolute horror, she found that it didn't sound like noise at all. It sounded like a storm on the high plains of Valoni. It sounded like home. She didn't tell him, of course. She just turned her back and closed her eyes, clutching her silence like a shield against the beauty of his noise. But the seed had been planted. The prejudice of her people, the idea that humans were nothing more than loud, messy children, had been cracked by a single wooden string. Presently, the strike team moved through the darkened corridors of the Icarus Aegis. Vaxen led the way, his sensor array scanning for any signs of the Void Blight or security droids. Karina and Vex walked on either side of him, their blades ready, their scales synchronized in a steady, determined blue. We're 3 levels down from the observation lounge, Vaxen whispered, his voice echoing in the hollow hallway. The elevator shaft is blocked by a massive growth of the blight. We're going to have to go through the service tunnels again. I grow tired of your tunnels, Kroll, Vex muttered, though there was a hint of humor in his vibration. Yeah, well, welcome to my world, Commander. It's dark, it's cramped, and it smells like ozone. Get used to it. Suddenly, the ship lurched violently to the left. The gravity plates screamed as they struggled to compensate for his sudden loss of mass. Vaxin was thrown against the wall, his flashlight spinning out of his hand. What was that? Karina shouted, catching him before he could fall. Atmospheric breach in Sector 5. Vaxin yelled over the sound of the emergency alarms. The blight is eating the external hull. The ship is falling apart, Sol. If we don't reach that canister in the next 10 minutes, there won't be an Icarus Aegis left to save. Then we stop crawling, Karina said, her scales blazing a fierce, brilliant white. She looked at Vex. Commander, the center path. Full resonance. We clear the way. Vex nodded, a fierce joy igniting in his amber eyes. For the true silence, the 2 Vorgoth warriors stepped forward, their blades humming at a frequency that made Vaxon's hair stand on end. They didn't move like soldiers. They moved like a force of nature. They charged down the corridor, their blades carving through the oily tentacles of the Void Blight as if they were nothing more than cobwebs. Vaxine scrambled after them, his heart pounding in his ears. He saw the way they moved, the perfect, disciplined coordination of the Vorgoth, now tempered by a desperate human urgency. They were no longer fighting for a code. They were fighting for their lives. They reached the doors of the observation lounge, which were coated in a thick, pulsing layer of the purple spores. The air here was thick with the scent of rotting metal and ancient, cold malice. Kroll, the door! Karina shouted, parrying a lunge from a massive, reconstituted security droid that had been taken over by the Blight. Vaxin dove for the control panel, his hands shaking as he pulled the wires. It's encrypted. The Elders have a hard lock on the system. I need a minute. You have 30 seconds, Vex roared, his blade clashing against the droid's armored claw. Vaxin blocked out the sound of the battle. He blocked out the alarms, the groaning of the ship, and the smell of the rot. He focused on the code. He saw the logic of the Vorgoth Elders, a cold, sterile, and ultimately hollow architecture. He didn't try to hack it with logic. He hacked it with chaos. He bypassed the encryption by feeding a loop of his own recorded guitar music into the security processor. The system, unable to process the unstructured, organic data of the music, began to stutter. The processors overheated, the logic gates jammed, and with a final digital scream, the doors slid open. Get in, Vaxine yelled, grabbing his welder. They burst into the lounge. The room was beautiful, filled with lush, green plants from a dozen different worlds, now all being slowly choked to death by the black oil of the Void Blight. In the center of the room, standing before the massive viewport that looked out into the cold, uncaring void of space, were the two elders. They turned, their faces calm, their eyes cold. "You are too late, children," the elder in the center said. He held the crystalline canister in his hand. It was glowing with a sickly, pulsing purple light that seemed to swallow the very stars outside. "The Oblivion Protocol has reached its final stage. The ship will be erased in 3 minutes. You have chosen to die with the filth, and so you shall." He raised the canister, preparing to smash it against the floor and release the final, lethal surge of the blight. "Kroll, now!" Karina shouted. But before Vaxen could move, a blast of resonance energy from one of the elders hit him square in the chest. He was thrown backward, his welder clattering across the floor, his vision swimming in a sea of red. He felt the air leave his lungs, the coldness of the ship beginning to seep into his bones. He watched, helplessly, as the elder raised the canister higher. He watched as Karina and Vex were pinned down by a wall of energy, their blades flickering and dying under the pressure of the elder's superior resonance. It was over. They had failed. The prejudice had won. The silence was coming. And then Vaxen felt something in his pocket. A small, crinkled bag. Zesty zingers. He reached for the bag, his fingers clumsy and numb. He remembered what he had told Karina on that first day. Sometimes you need a bit of static to know you're alive. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have a code. He only had the chaos. With the last of his strength, Vaxen threw the bag of chips at the elder. The bag hit the elder's glowing, resonance-filled hand and burst open. A cloud of bright orange, chemical-filled dust exploded into the air. The elder, whose senses were tuned to the ultimate, sterile perfection of the Vorgoth, was suddenly overwhelmed by the abrasive, artificial intensity of the dust. He coughed. He blinked. His focus faltered. And in that split second of human-induced chaos, the resonance field collapsed. Karina lunged forward, her blade a golden streak of lightning. She didn't strike the elder. She struck the canister. The crystal shattered, but it didn't release a surge of the blight. Instead, deprived of its directive and shattered by the golden resonance of Karina's blade, the energy imploded. A wave of white light swept through the room, turning the purple spores to ash and the black oil to harmless water. The void blight was gone. Vaxen lay on the floor, gasping for air, as the elders fell to their knees, their power broken by a bag of corn chips and a warrior who had learned to listen to the storm. Karina walked over to him and knelt by his side. Her scales were a soft, shimmering violet. She picked up a single orange chip from the floor and looked at it with a mixture of awe and amusement. "Chaos," she whispered, her voice a warm, gentle vibration. "It is a very effective weapon, Vaxen Kroll." "Yeah," Vaxen wheezed, a weak grin spreading across his face. "Told you. Middle ground, Sul. It's a beautiful thing." The immediate aftermath of the battle in the observation lounge was a frantic blur of technical triage. While Commander Vex and his remaining loyalists rounded up the two elders, who now looked like nothing more than withered gray statues stripped of their arrogance, Vaxen was buried up to his elbows in the lounge's primary life support terminal. The atmospheric pressure was still dropping, and the oxygen scrubbers were wheezing like a pack of heavy smokers. Every second counted. "Kroll, sit rep!" Karina's voice came over the comms, though she was only 5 meters away. The internal speakers were still glitching, producing a strange, echoing reverb. "I'm working on it, Hardshell. The blight did a number on the oxygen exchange baffles. I've got to bypass the primary scrubbers and bridge them directly to the emergency tanks in Sector 9. Vaxen yelled back, his hands moving with a desperate, practiced speed. "It's like trying to fix a leak in a dam with a piece of gum and a prayer. Shirmaninonom." "You have 12 minutes of breathable air remaining," Karina stated, her voice calm but her scales flickering a tense, nervous yellow. "The refugees in the lower decks have even less. The carbon dioxide levels are reaching lethal concentrations." I know, Vaxen snarled, a spark from the terminal singing his eyebrow. "Just talk to me. Keep my head in the game. Tell me something about your world. Tell me about those high planes you're always on about." Karina paused. She looked out through the massive viewport. The Icarus Aegis was currently drifting on the edge of a vast, shimmering nebula, the gases glowing with shades of amethyst and gold. It was beautiful, but to a Vorgoth, beauty without structure was a tragedy. "The high plains of Velonis are not like this," she said, her voice dropping into a rhythmic, melodic thrum. There is a grass there that grows in perfect, geometric spirals. It reflects the light of our three suns in a way that creates a symphony of color. When the wind blows, the grass sings a low, resonant chord that can be heard for miles. It is the sound of the world breathing in unison. Sounds peaceful, Vaxon grunted, finally snapping the bypass into place. A faint hiss of fresh air began to flow from the vents. A bit too quiet for me, but peaceful. It was the only peace I knew, Karina whispered, until I heard your box of wood. Vaxon stopped for a second, looking up at her. Her scales were a soft, shimmering blue, and in the dim light of the lounge, she looked less like a warrior and more like a poet. He realized that they had both been exiles in their own way, she from her silence, and he from a world that had become too small for his messy, complicated heart. Well, Vaxon said, wiping his brow, once we get this ship to Heliox Prime, maybe I'll take you to Earth. We've got a place called the Grand Canyon. It doesn't sing, but it's got a hell of an echo. You'd love it. It's just a big, beautiful accident of nature. An accident, Karina repeated, a small smile touching her lips. I think I am beginning to appreciate accidents, Vaxon Kroll. 90 days before the blackout, the Icarus Aegis was undergoing a standard weapon calibration drill. The tension between the human and Vorgoth crews had settled into a wary, fragile truce, but the air was still thick with unspoken prejudices. Vaxon had been assigned to the sparring deck to help calibrate the feedback sensors on the Vorgoth training droids. He was sitting on a bench nursing a cup of terrible synth calf when Karina entered the room. She was wearing her light combat skins, her obsidian scales gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. You are early for your shift, Kroll, she observed, picking up a training hilt. Couldn't sleep, Vaxon replied, shrugging. The gravity plates on Deck 4 have a hum that's out of tune. It was driving me up the wall. You here to beat up some more robots? I am here to maintain my focus, Karina said, activating the droid. The body is a vessel for the mind. If the vessel is weak, the mind becomes cluttered. Yeah, vessel, mind, logic. I've heard the speech, Vaxon said, standing up and stretching. But you know, you're always fighting things that move in straight lines, Sul. These droids are programmed with Vorgoth combat patterns. They're predictable. They're structured. They're boring. Karina stopped, her blade humming in a low guard. She looked at him, her amber eyes narrowing. Predictability is the hallmark of mastery. To move with precision is to conquer the chaos. Maybe in your world, Vaxon said, a mischievous glint in his eyes. But in the real world, the bad guys don't always follow the manual. Sometimes they trip. Sometimes they sneeze. Sometimes they throw a bag of chips at your head. Forniturn. He walked over to the droid's control panel and began to tap in a series of commands. I'm going to give this thing a human variable patch. It's going to be 30% less precise and 40% more annoying. Want to try it out? Karina raised an eyebrow. You think you can improve upon 1,000 years of Vorgoth martial science with a patch? I don't think I can improve it. I just think I can make it more interesting. Come on, hard shell. Show me that perfect silence in the face of a little bit of human messiness. Karina sighed, her scales flickering a dismissive green. Very well. Activate the annoyance, Kroll. The droid lurched to life. It didn't move with the fluid, geometric grace of a Vorgoth warrior. It stumbled. It twitched. It moved in erratic, jerky patterns that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Karina lunged forward, expecting a standard parry, but the droid suddenly dropped to its knees and swung its arm in a clumsy, wide arc that caught her right in the shins. Hey! Karina shouted, stumbling back. Her scales flashed a bright, startled yellow. Variable 1, the low blow, Vaxon laughed, leaning against the wall. Karina growled and attacked again, her blade a blur of silver light, but the droid didn't defend. It simply turned its back and ran to the other side of the room. When Karina chased after it, the droid suddenly stopped and threw a localized sonic burst that knocked her off balance. Variable 2, the tactical retreat, Vaxon shouted, and the oh no you don't surprise. For the next 20 minutes, the sparring deck was filled with the sound of clashing energy and Karina's increasingly frustrated shouts. She was one of the finest warriors in the Vanguard, a master of a dozen different disciplines, but she was being humiliated by a robot that moved like a drunk sailor. Finally, after the droid had managed to accidentally trip her for the third time, Karina deactivated her blade and stood in the center of the room, her chest heaving, her scales a mottled, angry purple. "This is not combat," she roared, pointing at the droid. This is a farce. There is no logic. There is no honor." "But you're still alive, aren't you?" Vaxin asked, his voice suddenly serious. He walked over to her, his expression softening. "In a real fight, the person who wins isn't the one with the best form. It's the one who can adapt to the mess. You were so busy looking for the perfect move that you missed the right move." Karina looked at the droid, then back at Vaxin. Her anger slowly faded, replaced by a quiet, thoughtful stillness. Her scales settled into a soft, shimmering blue. "The right move," she whispered, "even if it is ugly?" "Especially if it's ugly," Vaxin said. He reached out and touched her arm, the first time he had ever done so without a reason. "The universe is ugly, Karina. It's loud, it's messy, and it's full of accidents. But that's where the beauty is, in the way we handle the mess together." Karina looked at his hand on her arm. She didn't pull away. She felt the warmth of his skin, the frantic, uneven pulse of his human heart. It was a rhythm that was entirely alien to her. Yet in that moment, it felt more honest than any Vorgoth chant. "You are a very strange teacher, Vaxin Kroll," she said, her voice a warm, gentle vibration. "Yeah, well, I've had a lot of practice being a screw-up," Vaxin grinned. "And you're a pretty good student. For a hard shell." "See." They stood there for a long time in the quiet of the sparring deck, the droid twitching in the corner, the sensors recording a resonance that was neither Vorgoth nor human, but something entirely new, a middle ground. Presently, the Icarus Aegis began to settle. The frantic groaning of the hull had subsided into a steady, comforting hum. The oxygen levels were climbing back into the green, and the emergency lights were being replaced by the soft, blue glow of the primary power grid. "We did it, Vaxin," Karina said, stepping back from the viewport. She looked at him, her eyes glowing with a quiet, fierce pride. "The ship is stable. The refugees are safe. The elders are in custody." "Yeah," Vaxin said, slumping into one of the lounge's plush chairs. He felt like he could sleep for 1,000 years. "We did it, but we've still got a lot of work to do. The Aegis is held together by spit and duct tape, and we've got a 3-day journey to Heliox Prime. It's going to be a long haul." "I do not mind the journey," Karina said, sitting down on the floor beside him. She leaned her head against the arm of his chair. "As long as there is music." Vaxin looked down at her, his heart full. He reached out and stroked the smooth obsidian scales of her shoulder. "I think I can manage that. I might even have a spare bag of zingers hidden in the engine room." "No," Karina said, her scales flickering a playful green. "I think I have had enough zing for one lifetime." Suddenly the lounge door opened and Commander Vex entered. He looked tired, his armor scorched, and his scales a somber gray, but he carried himself with a new, quiet dignity. "Commander Soul, Lieutenant Kroll," Vex said, inclined his head in a gesture of profound respect. "The crew is beginning the primary repairs. We have established a secure perimeter around the lounge." He paused, looking at the two of them, the human engineer and the Vorgoth warrior, sitting together in the ruins of their prejudices. "The Council will face justice at Heliox Prime," Vex continued, his voice firm. "But the damage they have done to our people, that will take much longer to heal. Many of the vanguards still believe in the silence. They will see this alliance as a weakness. Then we'll show them it's a strength," Vaxin said, standing up and offering a hand to Karina. "We'll show them that a little bit of noise is exactly what they need to hear the truth." Vex looked at Vaxin's outstretched hand. For a long moment, the ancient traditions of the Vorgoth battled with the reality of the past hour. Then slowly, Vex reached out and grasped Vaxin's hand in a firm, human-style grip. "Perhaps you are right, Kroll," Vex said, a hint of a vibration in his voice that might have been a laugh. "But I still find your music to be quite abrasive." "Don't worry, Vex," Vaxin grinned. "I'll play something quiet for the journey. Just for you." As Vex left the room, Karina stood up and walked to the viewport. She looked out at the nebula, the amethyst and gold gases swirling in the dark. Vaccine, she asked, her voice a soft, melodic thrum. Yeah, Sul? What happens next? When we reach Heliox Prime? When the war is over? Vaccine walked up behind her and rested his chin on her shoulder. He looked out at the stars, the infinite possibilities of the universe stretching out before them. I don't know, he said, and for the first time in his life, the uncertainty didn't frighten him. But I know we're going to face it together. We'll make some noise. We'll fix what's broken, and we'll definitely find that donut shop. Karina leaned back against him, her scales glowing a warm, peaceful violet. Together, she repeated. It is a good word, Vaxen Kroll. A very good word. And in the quiet of the observation lounge, as the Icarus Aegis sailed through the starlight, the silence was no longer a shield. It was a space, waiting to be filled with the beautiful, chaotic, and perfectly human music of their lives. The orbital station of Heliox Prime was a massive, shimmering crown of crystal and cold light, hanging in the velvet dark of the Velonis Reach. It was the architectural embodiment of Vorgoth perfection, a series of geometric spires that hummed with the collective resonance of 5,000 elite citizens. From the viewport of the Icarus Aegis, it looked like a diamond caught in the glow of a dying star. But to Vaxen Kroll, as he watched the station grow larger in the glass, it looked like a very expensive, very beautiful cage. The Icarus Aegis itself was a wreck. It limped into the docking bay like a wounded predator, its hull scarred by black necrotic burns and its primary thrusters coughing out erratic pulses of blue flame. The ship was held together by little more than Vaxen's stubbornness and 3 kilometers of emergency duct tape, but it had survived. They had survived. Yet, as the magnetic grapples locked onto the hull with a series of heavy, metallic thuds, the expected cheers of a rescued crew never came. Instead, the internal comms remained chillingly silent. Vaxen stood in the center of the bridge, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his grease-stained flight jacket. He looked at Karina Sol. She was standing at the command station, her posture a straight, unyielding line of obsidian. Her scales were a dull, respectful gray, a color she had maintained since they crossed the threshold of the Heliox system. She was no longer the warrior who had laughed at a bag of corn chips. She was a daughter of the vanguard, preparing to face her fathers. They're coming for us, aren't they? Vaxen asked, his voice low and raspy from 48 hours of breathing recycled air and tension. The High Council does not allow for deviations, Karina replied, her voice a vibration that barely reached his ears. We have brought truth to their doorstep, Vaxen. But truth is often the most offensive sound in a world built on silence. The airlock hissed open, but the people who stepped through weren't medical teams or engineers. They were the peacekeepers of the caste of logic, 10 warriors in bone-white armor, their faces hidden behind reflective visors. They didn't offer greetings. They didn't offer help. They leveled their resonance staves at Karina and Vaxen with a synchronized mechanical precision. Commander Karina Sol, the lead peacekeeper, announced, the voice modulated to a flat, emotionless drone. You are charged with the desecration of a holy relay and the unauthorized collaboration with a foreign biological entity. You will follow us to the Spire of Reflection. Vaxen took a step forward, his jaw set. Foreign biological entity? You mean the guy who fixed the ship? Are you serious right now? We just saved 200 of your people from being turned into black sludge by your own damn elders. The peacekeeper didn't even look at him. Lieutenant Vaxen Kroll, you will be escorted to the human quarantine block for debriefing by the Synaptic Concord Brass. Your presence on the bridge is a violation of the Heliox Accords. Vaxen felt a surge of heat in his chest, a white-hot anger that made his vision blur. He looked at Karina, expecting her to fight, to draw her blade, to show them the golden resonance that had saved the Icarus Aegis. But she simply inclined her head. She didn't look back as they led her away, her footsteps echoing in a hollow, rhythmic beat that felt like a funeral march. Stay frosty, Kroll, Vaxen whispered to himself, his fingers curling into fists. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. The human quarantine block was a sterile, white-walled box that smelled of bleach and clinical indifference. For 3 days, Vaxen was subjected to a relentless stream of questions from a committee of generals and diplomats who looked like they had never seen a day of actual dirt in their lives. They didn't want to hear about the void blight. They didn't want to hear about the Elder's betrayal. They wanted to know why he had tampered with Vorgoth technology. They wanted to know if he had corrupted a high-ranking liaison. "She isn't a liaison, she's a person," Vaxen shouted at a colonel who looked like he'd been carved out of balsa wood. "And I didn't corrupt her. I taught her how to survive when her own people were busy trying to murder her." The colonel sighed, clicking a silver pen. "Lieutenant, you are a technician, a gearhead. You don't understand the delicate balance of the Concord. The Vorgoth are our primary allies. If we admit that their High Council is riddled with genocidal separatists, the entire alliance falls apart. It's better to call it a technical malfunction." A tragic accident. An accident? Vaxin leaned over the table, his face inches from the colonel's. 200 people were almost KIA because of a technical malfunction? That's a big ask, even for the brass. You're going to let them bury her, aren't you? You're going to let them erase her because she's a nuisance to your neat little spreadsheets. The colonel didn't answer. He just signaled for the guards. That night, Vaxin sat on the edge of his narrow bunk, staring at the white ceiling. He thought about the silence of the Vorgoth. He thought about how easy it was to stay quiet, to follow the rules, to avoid the mess. He could take his honorable discharge, his medals, and his pension, and he could go back to Earth. He could find a quiet shop and fix old engines until his heart stopped. It was the safe move, the logical move. But then he remembered the sound of Karina's voice when she told him about the high plains. He remembered the way her scales had glowed violet when she realized that chaos could be beautiful. If I stay quiet now, I'm just another brick in their wall, he thought. And I've never been good at being a brick. He stood up and walked to the door. He didn't have his flux welder. He didn't have his kit. But he had 40 years of experience being a loud-mouthed engineer who knew every shortcut in the book. He hacked the room's climate control, triggering a localized smoke alarm that sent the guards scrambling for the extinguishers. In the confusion, he slipped through the ventilation shaft, a trick he'd learned on the Aegis, and began his descent toward the Vorgoth sector. The spire of reflection was a needle of obsidian that pierced the heart of Heliox Prime. It was where the Vorgoth sent those who had lost their resonance, a place of sensory deprivation and forced meditation. It was where they went to be realigned. Or, as Vaxen suspected, where they went to have their souls scrubbed clean. He reached the spire 2 hours later, his hands raw and his flight jacket torn. The security here was tighter, but it was built on the assumption that no one would be stupid enough to try and break into a Vorgoth prison. They hadn't accounted for a human with zero regard for personal safety and a pocket full of stolen bypass chips. He found her in a chamber at the very top of the spire. The room was a perfect circle of dark glass, looking out over the nebula. Karina was suspended in the center of the room by a series of humming resonance fields. Her scales were a deathly, translucent white. Her eyes were closed, and her breathing was so slow, it was almost non-existent. "Soul!" Vaxin hissed, running to the edge of the field. "Karina, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened, but they were dull, the amber glow replaced by a flat gray film. "Vaxin Kroll," she whispered, the vibration so weak it barely reached the floor. "You should not be here. This is the price of silence. I must find the perfect frequency. I must erase the noise." "Like hell you will," Vaxin shouted, slamming his fist against the energy field. The spark made his arm go numb, but he didn't care. "They're brainwashing you. They're trying to turn you back into a statue. Don't you remember the ship? Don't you remember the donut?" "I remember. The mess," she murmured, her scales flickering a faint, painful yellow. "But the mess is a sickness. The elders said that to love the noise is to invite the void. The elders are the ones who invited the void, soul. They used the blight. They tried to kill us." Vaxin's voice broke, a raw, jagged sound that filled the sterile room. "I'm not letting you go back into that box. I'm not letting them take the only person who actually understands why I fix things." He looked at the control console for the resonance field. It was a complex crystalline interface that required a perfect harmonic match to deactivate. He didn't have the codes. He didn't have the frequency. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his old battered guitar. He'd managed to smuggle it through the quarantine by telling the guards it was a religious relic. In a way, it was. Vaccine, no, Karina whispered, her eyes widening. The sensors, they will detect the deviation. They will come. Let them come, Vaccine said, sitting down on the floor and resting the guitar on his knee. I've been making too much noise for 34 years to stop now. He began to play. It wasn't a song she knew. It wasn't a structured melody. It was a chaotic, soulful blues riff, full of bent notes and rhythmic stutters. He played with everything he had, his fingers flying over the strings, his heart pouring into the wooden box. The sound echoed in the spire of reflection, a beautiful, messy human noise that shattered the sterile silence of the room. The resonance field began to flicker. The crystals in the console started to vibrate, struggling to process the unstructured data. Karina's scales began to glow, not the icy white of the council or the dull gray of the prison. They turned violet, then blue, then gold. The memory of their time together, the shared meals, the shared battles, the shared vulnerabilities began to flood back into her, washing away the forced alignment of the spire. She let out a scream, a real, vocal scream that tore through the air. The resonance field shattered, the energy dissipating in a shower of sparks. Karina fell from the air, and Vaccine caught her, the two of them collapsing onto the glass floor. You really are a very loud person, she gasped, her eyes clearing, the amber fire returning to her gaze. Yeah, well, someone's got to wake up the neighbors, Vaccine grinned, his eyes wet with relief. But the moment was short-lived. The doors of the chamber slid open, and Commander Vex stood there, flanked by a dozen peacekeepers. His scales were a dark, threatening red. Lieutenant Kroll, Vex said, his voice a heavy thrum, you have committed an act of war against the Vorgoth hegemony. There is no middle ground left for you. Karina stood up, leaning on Vaccine's shoulder. She looked at Vex, then at the warriors, and finally at the human who had risked everything for a song. She straightened her back, her scales blazing a fierce, brilliant white that outshone the stars outside. There is always a middle ground, Vex, she said, her voice ringing with the authority of someone who had faced death and found it wanting. You just have to be brave enough to step into the noise. The air in the spire of reflection was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy electric taste of an impending storm. Commander Vex stood at the threshold, his resonance blade held in a low, disciplined guard. Behind him, the peacekeepers were a wall of bone-white armor, their staves humming with a lethal potential. Vaccine stood beside Karina, his old guitar slung over his back like a shield. He felt small. He felt fragile. He felt like a 5-cent part in a $1 million engine that was about to blow its gaskets. But as he looked at Karina, at the way her scales were pulsing with that defiant golden light, he realized he wasn't afraid. He was just tired of the script. Move aside, Commander, Karina said, her voice a low, steady vibration that filled the room. The elders have betrayed the vanguard. They have used our silence to hide their crimes. If you strike us down, you are simply finishing what the Void Blight started. Vex's scales flickered an uncertain purple. You speak of betrayal, Sul, but you are the one standing with the polluter. You have broken the sacred alignment of the spire. You have turned your back on the perfect silence. The silence is a lie, Vex. Vaccine shouted, stepping forward. He didn't have a weapon, but he had a voice that had spent 20 years shouting over the roar of fusion cores. It's a box you build to keep from feeling the mess. But the mess is where the truth is. Your elders didn't want silence. They wanted control, and they used your pride to get it. Vex looked at Vaccine, and for a split second, the human saw a flicker of doubt in those amber eyes. It was a small crack, a negligible variance, but it was enough. The High Council has issued a direct order, Vex said, his voice straining against the logic of his own upbringing. You are to be executed for heresy. I have no choice. We always have a choice, Vex, Karina said, her voice softening. You chose to save the Aegis. You chose to fight beside a grease monkey. You felt the resonance of the ship, the heartbeat of the crew. Was that noise, or was that life? Suddenly, the floor beneath them shuddered. A deep, tectonic groan vibrated through the spire, followed by the distant sound of explosions. The lights in the chamber flickered, turning a sickly, pulsing purple. Vaccine's sensor array, still clipped to his belt, began to scream. Soul! The energy signature! It's back! Vex's scales flashed a startled yellow. The Void Blight? We destroyed the mother node. We destroyed the canister in the lounge. Vaccine yelled, his fingers flying over the sensor controls. But the Elders, they didn't just have one canister, they had a nursery. They've released a systemic pulse into the station's primary power grid. They're not just trying to kill us anymore. They're trying to erase the entire station. The spire of reflection was the highest point on Heliox Prime, and from the viewport, they could see the horror unfolding below. Black, oily streaks of the blight were spreading through the crystalline spires of the station, turning the brilliant white light to a necrotic, pulsing violet. The collective resonance of the citizens, the very thing that held the station together, was being turned against them. The blight was eating the harmony. It is the neural silence command, Vex whispered, his face turning a horrified gray. The Elders are using the station's own resonance to paralyze the population. They are forcing the silence permanently. Around them, the peacekeepers began to stumble. Their bone-white armor flickered, and they fell to their knees, clutching their heads. Their highly tuned Vorgoth senses were being overwhelmed by the Elders' lethal, forced frequency. Even Vex gasped, dropping his blade as his scales turned a flat, lightless black. Vaxin felt it too, a high-pitched whine in his skull that made his nose bleed. But he was human. His brain was a chaotic, disorganized mess of memories, emotions, and bad jokes. He didn't have a perfect frequency to be hijacked. He was the static in their system. Karina! Vaxin grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. She was swaying, her golden scales fading as she struggled against the mental tide. Don't let go. Use the noise. Remember the song. I cannot see, she gasped, her hands clawing at the air. It is so quiet. The Elders walked into the room. They weren't in custody. The peacekeepers who had been guarding them were now standing behind them, their eyes glazed, their movements mechanical. The lead Elder, his robes stained with black oil, looked at Vaxin with a cold, terrifying pity. You are a persistent parasite, Lieutenant Kroll, the Elder said, but your chaos cannot survive the end of all things. The station will become a monument to the silence, a perfect, dead diamond in the void. Vaxin looked at the Elder, then at the paralyzed warriors, then at the dying station below. He knew what he had to do. It was a move that had no logic, a move that was 99% likely to get him killed. A total wash. He reached for his guitar. Soul, Vex, listen to me. Vaxin roared, his voice cracking with the effort. If you try to fight them with logic, you lose. You have to break the rhythm. You have to be the accident. He slammed his hand against the strings, producing a discordant, jarring wall of sound. He didn't play a melody. He played the sound of a ship breaking. He played the sound of a heart failing. He played the noise of humanity. The Elder laughed, a dry, rattling sound. You think your wooden box can stop the resonance of 1,000 years? It's not the box, Vaxin hissed, blood dripping from his ears. It's the person holding it. He turned his sensor array to full broadcast, patching the guitar's output directly into the spire's primary resonance transmitter. He was going to use the spire to play a song for the entire station, a song of grease, sweat, and donuts. The Elder's face twisted in rage. Stop him! The mind-controlled peacekeepers lunged, but Karina, fueled by the discordant scream of the guitar, found a spark of herself in the static. She roared, a sound that was pure, unadulterated emotion, and lunged forward. She didn't use her blade. She used her hands, her scales, her very body to shield Vaxin. She took a hit from a resonance staff, her scales shattering like glass. She took another, her shoulder joint popping, but she didn't move. She stood over Vaxin like a goddess of the mess, her eyes burning with an amber fire that the Elders could not extinguish. Play it, Vaxin, she screamed, the vibrations of her voice joining the noise of the strings. Make them hear us. Vaxin closed his eyes. He didn't think about the notes. He thought about every engine he'd ever fixed. He thought about his father's workshop on Earth. He thought about the first time he'd seen Karina smile. He poured every ounce of his messy, beautiful, flawed human soul into the broadcast. The spire of reflection erupted. A wave of chaotic, unstructured energy shot out from the spire, sweeping across Heliox Prime like a tidal wave of color and sound. It hit the void blight, and the necrotic fog shrieked, its systemic logic shattered by the human variable. It hit the citizens, and the neural silence was broken, replaced by a sudden, jarring awareness of their own individuality. The elders screamed as their perfect frequency was torn to shreds. They fell back, their robes catching fire from the overload of the crystals. The black oil on their skin turned to ash, and they crumbled into the very void they had worshipped. Silence returned to the spire, but it wasn't the silence of the Vorgoth. It was the silence of a long overdue rest. Vaxin slumped over his guitar, the strings broken, his fingers bleeding. He looked up and saw Karina kneeling beside him. Her armor was gone, her scales were bruised, and she was crying. Vorgoth didn't usually have tear ducts that functioned like humans, but she was leaking a clear, shimmering fluid that caught the light of the nebula. You did it, she whispered, her voice a soft, beautiful melody. You made the universe listen. We did it, Vaxin corrected her, reaching out and wiping a tear from her cheek. His hand was shaking, but it was a good shake, a human shake. Vex stood up, his scales a sober, thoughtful blue. He looked at the two of them, then at the station below, where the purple light was fading and the white light was returning. But this time, it was warmer. It was softer. The High Council is gone, Vex said, his voice no longer a flat drone, but a rich, complex vibration. The Concord will have to be rebuilt, from the ground up. Vaxin looked at the commander, then at the guitar. Yeah, and this time, maybe we can add a few more instruments to the orchestra. He looked back at Karina, and he realized that the transformation he had seen in her was mirrored in himself. He had come to the Aegis as a man who only trusted machines, because machines didn't have feelings that could get hurt. He had seen the Vorgoth as cold, unfeeling statues, but he had learned that the only way to truly fix anything, a ship, a station, or a soul, was to be brave enough to feel the mess. The danger of prejudice wasn't just that it hurt the other person, it was that it kept you in a cage of your own making. It kept you silent when you needed to scream. It kept you alone when you could have been together. So, Soul, Vaxin said, leaning his head against hers, about that donut, I think we're going to need a whole box. Karina smiled, a real wide smile that showed the strength of her spirit and the depth of her noise. I think, Vaxin Kroll, that for the first time in my life, I am hungry for the mess. They sat together at the edge of the glass floor, watching the stars come back to life. The Icarus Aegis was still a wreck. The station was in ruins, and the future was a giant, terrifying question mark. But as Vaxin held Karina's hand, he knew that the resonance of their ruin was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. And for the first time in 1,000 years, Heliox Prime was not silent. It was alive. The silence that followed the collapse of the High Council was not the sterile, pressurized void of the spire of reflection. It was a thick, heavy quiet, like the air in a room after a long-awaited storm has finally broken. On Heliox Prime, the amethyst-colored necrotic fog of the void blight began to dissipate into harmless particulate matter, falling like gray snow onto the crystalline walkways. The station was no longer humming with a single oppressive frequency. Instead, it was filled with the sounds of recovery, the frantic clatter of repair droids, the low melodic murmurs of Vorgoth citizens awakening from their neural stupor, and the heavy rhythmic thuds of human security teams establishing order. Vaxin Kroll sat on the edge of a shattered crystalline planter in the station's central plaza. His flight jacket was shredded, his face was a mosaic of dried blood and grease, and his hands were wrapped in makeshift bandages. Beside him, his acoustic guitar lay in its battered case, two of its strings snapped and curling like silver vines. He looked at his hands, watching the way they shook. It wasn't the adrenaline of the fight anymore. It was the sheer, crushing weight of what they had done. He had spent 34 years believing that the universe was just a collection of broken machines waiting for a wrench. He had used his humor as a shield and his technical skill as a bunker, convinced that if he just kept the engines running, he wouldn't have to deal with the messy, unpredictable business of being alive. But standing in that spire, watching Karina nearly vanish into the perfect silence, he had realized that machines were easy. It was the people, the loud, complicated, prejudice-filled people, who actually mattered. "You are staring again, Vaxon." A familiar vibration reached him. He looked up to see Karina Sewell. She was draped in a simple dark gray cloak that covered the scorched remains of her armor. Her scales were a soft, muted violet, the color of a twilight sky on Earth. She didn't look like a blade mistress of the Vanguard anymore. She looked like someone who had finally stepped out of a very long, very dark tunnel. "I'm not staring, Sewell. I'm calculating," Vaxon rasped, offering a weak, lopsided grin. "Calculating how many years of my life I just shaved off by playing that last set. I'm pretty sure my liver is currently vibrating at a frequency that shouldn't exist in nature." Karina sat down beside him, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't mind the grease on his jacket. She didn't mind the chaos of the plaza around them. She simply rested her hand on his bandaged knuckles. Her touch was warm, a steadying presence that anchored him to the moment. "The healers say the systemic pulse from the relay has been neutralized," she said, her voice a rich, complex melody. "The elders who survived are being held in the lower detention blocks. There is talk of a new council, one that includes the voices of the lower castes, and perhaps even voices from the Concord." Vaxin exhaled, the sound a long, weary whistle. "A joint council. That's going to be a real circus. You think your people are ready for that? They've spent 1,000 years thinking we're just noisy apes with fancy tools. And your people have spent decades thinking we are cold, unfeeling statues," Karina replied, her amber eyes glowing with a quiet, fierce wisdom. "Prejudice is a comfort, Vaxon. It is a way of organizing the universe so that we do not have to feel the fear of the unknown. But after today, I think many have realized that the perfect silence was just a very beautiful grave." A few meters away, Commander Vex was overseeing a group of Vorgoth warriors and human engineers as they worked together to stabilize a collapsed support beam. Vex was no longer barking orders in a flat mechanical drone. He was listening. He was watching a human technician explain the structural integrity of a titanium alloy brace, and though his scales were still a wary shade of blue, he wasn't turning away. "Look at him," Vaxon whispered, nodding toward Vex. "He's actually trying to learn the human variable. It's a miracle." "It is not a miracle," Karina said. "It is a choice. We have been shown that our survival depends on the harmony of our differences, not the elimination of them. The blight fed on our isolation. It was defeated by our resonance." Vaxon looked at his broken guitar. "Yeah, but the resonance came with a hell of a price tag. Look at this place, Saul. It's a wreck. We're going to be fixing Heliox Prime for the next 20 years. "Then we shall fix it together," Karina said. She stood up, pulling him with her. "But first there is a matter of a promise involving a specific, replicated delicacy and a great deal of sugar." Vaxon laughed, and for the first time in days, it didn't feel forced. "The donuts." "Right. I think I saw a working replicator in the tertiary mess hall. It might only produce 40% sugar and 60% disappointment, but it's a start." As they walked through the ruined plaza, two survivors of a war that had been fought with songs instead of bombs, the citizens of Heliox Prime watched them pass. There were no cheers, no fanfares, but there was a shift in the air, a vibration that was no longer a single, terrifying note, but a chaotic, vibrant hum. The noise was spreading, and for the first time in history, the Vorgoth were not afraid to listen. 6 months had passed since the night the Spire of Reflection had screamed with the sound of a human guitar. The Icarus Aegis had been refitted, its hull polished until it gleamed like a silver dart against the black velvet of the Velonis Reach. It was no longer just a human ship or a Vorgoth ship. It was a diplomatic vessel, a mobile testament to the new resonance accords that were slowly, painstakingly reshaping the alliance between Earth and the Tavan territories. Vaxon Kroll was in the primary engineering bay, elbow deep in the coolant manifold of the ship's new hybrid resonance core. He wasn't alone. Beside him was a young Vorgoth apprentice named Tael, whose scales were a bright, enthusiastic green. No, no, Tyle, Vaxon said, wiping a smear of lubricant onto his forehead. You're tightening the flux nut too much. Remember what I told you? Machines aren't just equations. They've got temperaments. You have to feel the vibration. If it's too tight, the crystal can't breathe. If it's too loose, the energy leaks like a sieve. You've got to find that muddle-through sweet spot. Tal looked at the manifold, his head tilted in concentration. To muddle through is to accept an imperfect alignment, Master Kroll. Is that truly the human method? It's the only method that works in a universe that's 99% entropy, kid. Vaxon grinned, stepping back to admire their work. Perfect is a myth, functional is a victory. Now let's fire it up. The core hummed to life, a deep, resonant sound that was a perfect blend of human engineering and Vorgoth crystalline science. It was a stable, rhythmic beat, the heart of a ship that no longer feared the dark. Vaxon checked his chrono. It was 1800 hours. Time for the daily debrief. Or as he liked to call it, the roommate report. He made his way up to quarter 402. The room had been expanded, the invisible wall between their halves long since demolished. On one side, his workbench was still a mess of drones and half-eaten snacks, but now there were sketches of Vorgoth architecture pinned to the wall. On the other side, Karina's obsidian platform remained, but it was surrounded by shelves of human books and a small potted plant from the high plains of Velonis that Vaxen had painstakingly cultivated in a pressurized terrarium. Karina was sitting on the platform, but she wasn't meditating. She was holding his guitar, her long, graceful fingers clumsily plucking at a string. She looked up as he entered, her scales flickering a shy, shimmering violet. I have been attempting to find the zing of the G chord, she said, her voice a warm, melodic vibration. It is challenging. My fingers do not possess the necessary calluses. Give it time, Hardshell, Vaxon said, tossing his jacket onto his bunk. You've spent your whole life being a sword. It takes a while to learn how to be a song. He sat down beside her, and they looked out the viewport. They were currently orbiting the planet Nexara, a vibrant world of blue oceans and swirling white clouds. It was home to one of the largest human colonies in the sector, and today it was the site of the first-ever Concord Unity Festival. Vex sent a transmission earlier, Karina said, resting the guitar against the wall. He says the new council has approved the trade agreement for the High Plains grass. They are going to use it to stabilize the biosphere on the lunar colonies. He sounded pleased. His vibrations were quite harmonic. Old Vex, a diplomat. Who would have thought? Vaxon shook his head. I guess we all had a few neglected variables we were hiding from. They sat in silence for a long moment, watching the sun rise over the limb of Nexara. It was a beautiful, chaotic sunset, filled with colors that defied the strict logic of the Vorgoth spectrum. Vaxon leaned back, his mind drifting over the journey that had brought them here. He thought about the man he had been 6 months ago, bitter, isolated, hiding behind his machines. He had walked into this room with a head full of prejudices, certain that he would never find common ground with a hard-shell warrior. He had been so afraid of being hurt, of losing his own identity to the silence of another culture, that he had almost missed the opportunity to truly live. He realized now that prejudice wasn't just a weapon used against others. It was a prison we built for ourselves. By labeling Karina as alien and cold, he had been excusing himself from the effort of understanding her. By labeling himself as just an engineer, he had been excusing himself from the responsibility of being a friend. It was only when the ship started to fall apart, when the machines failed and the logic broke, that he had been forced to see the truth. We are all just echoes in the dark, he thought, and the only way the darkness doesn't swallow us is if we echo together.